you like me to introduce you, Danielle?
You can do whatever you would prefer to do. I'm fine either way. I was just waiting to see from Jessica if she has it going on Facebook. Usually there's like a slight delay, so I just wanted to check that she's okay before we fully got started.
Okay, why don't we get this started? So I attended a meeting virtual meeting, but I attended a meeting held by University Park where they got an update on stormwater issues and things the county was working on. And when I reported this to some local residents, they asked whether we could get a similar update from Councilmember Danielle Claros. And so I reached out to her and suggested this evening as a possible time. I think she was on vacation at the time, but she eventually came into an area that had some cell phone coverage and was able to confirm that this was an okay time. And so she is here, and also Ken Dunn from the county, I believe, DPW team. And
well, we're actually private engineers, so I'm not
okay.
a county employee.
Okay, but you're contracted to the county.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and so they will let us know what is up with the 9-pond stormwater system update. Thank you very much for coming, Danielle, and thank you to everyone who's attending for taking some time out of your week to learn a little bit more about what's up.
Okay. Thank you, Mayor Thompson. Great to see you all tonight. Also want to do a special thanks to Ken. Ken joined us actually for the University Park presentation. He is the engineering team that's involved in the 9 Ponds project. And I am skillful at many things, but I'm not an expert in engineering. And so I really just appreciate Ken taking his time out of his evening to spend it with me and doing this presentation with all of you. I'm really happy to do it here for Riverdale Park. The presentation, just to forewarn everyone, it probably is a solid 30 minutes just to walk us through. We're going to tackle 9 ponds. We're also going to talk about some big picture other pieces going on stormwater management that I think are probably really helpful and important to lay some context. Happy to stay as long as needed to ask questions. And then I think most of you know, I do live in the town of Riverdale Park. I'm pretty easy to find. We're still doing all of our council sessions virtually, so I am at my house more than usual. But I'm happy to catch up with any one of you to follow up on anything from tonight as well. So with that, next slide. All right, so just to give you some background of Prince George's County, I think most of you know that we are 950,000 plus strong based on the latest census. This is a map of Prince George's, but also a map of all the 311 drainage complaints just over a few year period. I share this map because I think it's really important to keep in mind where Prince George's County is. I think most of you know the Northeast Branch really well. We do a lot of the bike trails. I know a lot of you also take advantage of those bike trails. We are a very low-lying county, and there are definitely issues throughout our entire county as we think about stormwater management and drainage concerns, whether that's sinkholes or flooding that might be happening in our community. Next page. This is specific District 3. I oftentimes tell people that yes, my district is sort of uniquely shaped, but we have just as many concerns about stormwater management and flooding across my entire district. As you can tell, my district has a lot of streams that are networked through it. We actually feed not only into the Anacostia River, but my easternmost portion of my district eventually flows into the Patuxent River as well. So once again, lots going on across this district. Next slide. Why Prince George's County? Why do these issues happen here in particular? I mean, I think there's been a lot in the news. I think all of us have been probably following some of what's been going on in Virginia and other places in Maryland, but in particular in Prince George's County, we have really flat land. We have really high groundwater. We have a lot of clay soil, which means we just don't percolate that water very quickly. And then also, like many communities, some of our communities were built before regulations were in place. And actually the timeline below sort of sets that in place. We've done a lot of upgrades over the years, but as many of you know, a lot of the existing infrastructure, our community, particularly here in Riverdale Park or College Park or Hyattsville, a lot of that was built out prior, for instance, to the 1980s. And then obviously we also are seeing greater impacts associated with climate change. And particularly we're seeing way more intense storms that are also very isolated storms, right? So we could have a very big storm here and not at all have any problems in Largo. Frankly, it could be isolated close enough to just be in Riverdale Park and not even be touching over in New Carrollton. That's how isolated and intense some of the storms are that are flowing now as our climate is shifting. Next slide. So I put this slide together. We actually, to be fair, we took it from a DPI presentation that they gave to the council, because I think it's really important to understand that here in Prince George's County, issues associated with water are covered by various different agencies. So it's covered by our Department of Environment. It's covered by our Department of Permits Inspection. It's also depends on our Department of Public Works and Transportation. So it really depends where the drainage issue is. Is it in the county public right of way? Is it on private property? As to which agency may be addressing that issue. They do coordination meetings rather frequently, in case you were curious about that. Next slide. So how do we fix these problems? Because they're not going to get better. And I do think we're going to need to take a different approach. So this is a good example of, I think, all the different types of things we need to put on the table. There really is no silver bullet. You know, 9 Ponds is going to, for instance, do a lot for our community, but it is not the only answer. And we cannot stop there in terms of thinking about other opportunities or options, right? Code changes matter. What homeowners or property owners are doing to their properties is important. The money that we're putting in to help solve some of these issues, what the development community is doing associated with their projects, all of these pieces are going to be really critically important. Next slide. So this is just a sense of some of the regulations out there. And we pulled this slide in part because here actually in my district, particularly the westernmost part, University of Maryland property, for instance, is oftentimes regulated under the state code, but there's also a county code. And the county code was updated back in 2006, if I remember correctly. And it actually did do a lot of really great best practices. But one of the ones I really want to share with you is that on redevelopment, we actually have one of the highest standards here now in the state of Maryland. And that definitely exists here in Prince George's County in terms of being able to reduce the impervious area within the limit of disturbance by 100%. We've been actually scaling that up every year, every few years since that law was passed. We also have a pretty aggressive standard for new development. And then we also have additional standards that we put in place based on watershed and flooding situations in the community and county. That doesn't mean that there isn't more to be done. I will never say there's never more to be done. But it is to say that you should know that we have pretty solid regs in place in this arena. Next slide. And this is actually one example of one thing that we do specifically if there is downstream flooding. And I talk about this one because it's relevant to our communities and the Wells Run watershed. But that for new development projects, if you are going to increase that runoff, we require a 100-year control. And we also want to make sure that you're reducing that stormwater runoff back to pre-development conditions, which is really important if changes are happening. Next slide. As was mentioned, this is really a multi-pronged approach, right? There's legislation. We definitely can take a look at even more enhancements associated with legislation, but there's also a role for homeowners in making sure that we are each doing what we need to do around our properties. Some of you are already doing that. You're participating in some of our county programs, but it's also taking a look at your property and saying, oh, look, I'm seeing more flooding here. I need to make sure that my property is draining appropriately, right? That it's not sloped to the house, it's sloped away from the house. But there's a lot of things that each of us can do on our properties, whether it's storm drain and yard inlets, whether it's grass swales, whether it's rain gardens at our properties. Next slide. One other piece that I'll just reference is that the flood insurance program here in Prince George's County, that we do encourage residents to be a part of that. Residents here in Prince George's County receive a 25% reduction in flood insurance rates. And that's because we have applied to make sure that we are part of the community rating system, and we participate in this with many other communities across the country. Next slide. Another opportunity, and I've actually seen several people in Riverdale Park taking advantage of this. You actually have your rain check sign in your front yard, so thank you for being part of the solution. The county actually has a fairly unique rain check rebate program. It's been in place for a really long time. I'll talk a little bit about some updates we're looking to do associated with this, but we will actually help support you with a rebate for doing best practices on your yard. That's everything from rain barrels to rain gardens to pavement removal to actually pretty impermeable pavement, perhaps where that driveway currently exists. This is available for both residential property. It's also available for commercial, industrial, and institutional property as well. Next slide, please. And as was mentioned, there's also roles that builders and developers can also play as we're doing this. And this is once again, just a list of what those are and some opportunities that exist there. Next slide. The county is also continuing to look at county investments, and these are also opportunities for builders and developers. They can install more storm drains in an area. We oftentimes look at additional stormwater management tools that can reduce downstream flows as part of development projects. People are also looking at reconstructing streets to a higher elevation, for instance, if that is lower than the floodplain. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we've been working over the last probably the last year now, actually, we're almost at the mark of when we had the September 10th flood. That will be 1 year anniversary as of tomorrow. One thing that we have been working on is very much a watershed approach strategy in our district. It is one thing to be doing projects. It's one thing for each of us to be individually doing our whole thing, but we need to be way more coordinated and organized in our approach. And we really need to think about this on a watershed level. This is an example, actually not of our watershed here, Wells Run, but of the Guilford Run watershed, which is the watershed that runs through Calvert Hills. It actually starts up at the intersection of Adelphi Road and University Boulevard and flows past the university. And actually half of the university campus contributes to this watershed. Next slide. So one thing we've been doing is actually coordinating a stakeholder approach. Starting a stormwater management group. That's actually been heavily successful in sort of having dialogue and discussions. We're sort of taking a pause on that as the city of College Park thinks more about its role with ARP money and additional funds to support the next stage of this stormwater management group. Next slide. So this is our watershed here. This is the Wells Run watershed. I don't know how many of you have seen this before. Now, this is obviously the upper portion of the Wells Run watershed. It actually continues to flow further down past Riverdale Elementary, and that would be sort of the sort of southern edge of it. But this gives you a sense of all the different area that flows into Wells Run. And it's really important as you think about a strategic approach of understanding not only where that water is coming from, but what sub area is that water coming from? And are there solutions within that sub area that can make a difference? One of the things and realizations on this map that I knew of, I knew we actually pulled in part of Prince George's plaza and the mall. I was actually well aware of that. I had actually not realized that Northwestern High School is part of this watershed, nor had I realized how deep we actually go into the city of Hyattsville as part of this, into almost actually Hyattsville Middle School is actually in this corner of this watershed. So understanding your watershed, understanding the projects that may be happening in the watershed, and understanding also the retrofits that could be possible that could change the CFSs that are flowing at 100-year in can be really helpful to thinking about how we further protect our communities and how we make our communities much more resilient. Next slide, please. So once again, this is a picture of the Wells Run watershed, and this talks to some of what is in play right now along this watershed as we move forward. Next slide. So the one question I'm going to pose here, and we can talk about this more at the end, is really, I think, the opportunity for there to really be a very formal Wells Run stormwater management group. I know that University Park and Riverdale Park have been working really well together over the years. There are other players and other property owners to really think about this. And most importantly, how do we leverage our ARP dollars that are our American Recovery Plan dollars, which can be used as stormwater management, to actually further investment within our watershed. But Riverdale Park cannot do it alone. Ward 1 cannot do it alone. At the end of the day, it really is going to take a coordinated approach. So happy to talk more about how we can, as my office, better support this work, but also support all of you. And I think really formalizing our partnership and the partnership in this community to really lift some variety of strategies to address stormwater management. Next slide. All right, so this actually my team just threw in, but one of these is a really good example of why it's good to have the University of Maryland at the table. Some of you may or may not know, but University of Maryland, one of their teams is actually working on stormwater sensor systems. I was actually just part of a conversation last week. I think actually maybe John Letition from Riverdale Park, or someone from Riverdale Park, I believe, joined virtually as well. So there's a lot of opportunity for us to think about how we can also start to get real live data about what is going on in our watershed. One of the challenges right now, as we're having these extreme storms and more frequent storms, is there is not really good rain gauges on a watershed level basis, right? We've never been set up that way. That's never been the approach, but we need it to be, so we really understand the system. And then one of the things that I really push them to is I'd like to also us to get to a place where actually these sensors could also almost do hyper local alerts if we are cresting or getting close to a flood stage in our area, which I think can be really helpful in our community. So partners at the table who can offer creative solutions, can help us craft data, go after grants, and go after other opportunities is really critical as we wrap our arms around this, not only understanding fully the program, but be really strategic about the solutions that deliver results and resilience in our community. Next slide. All right, so let me shift to talking about 9 ponds. Many of you may or may not know this, so I'll just recap a little. So the county has the Clean Water Partnership. This is actually a public-private partnership that was started many years ago. It's been highly successful in delivering projects within our community that decrease the level of impervious surface here in Prince George's County. You can actually see that number on the total on the bottom right. It's over 5,000 plus acres, if I got the math right. Yep, 5,000 acres have already been addressed. We have 204 projects that are either in design, planning, or already completed. We continue to add more projects to this. For those of you who just got your tax bill, you actually see this showing up on your tax bill. That's exactly where the money is going for. It goes to this partnership to deliver real projects in our community. And if you go to the website, you can see all the projects that they've completed across the county or ones that are pipelined. Next slide. So I'm going to shift just to talk about 9 Pond. That's one of these projects that your taxpayer dollars are making to happen. And it's a big project in your community. I think for these slides, I'm going to turn it over to Ken Dunn. Ken, if I remember, this is where I turned it over to you last time to sort of talk everyone through these slides.
Sure, thanks, Danielle. And I, as always, you've done a great job sort of explaining higher level stormwater management, even down to the micro level. What we have here is a slide that represents the municipality. The purple color represents generally the municipalities that are impacted by the wells run, that in some way, shape, or form will be impacted by the construction of 9 ponds. What we're trying to do here with 9 ponds, and if you remember one of some of the earlier slides that Danielle showed, 9 pond location, which is about the center point of the picture here. I don't know if you have a cursor that you can place on it, but you can see it labeled right there. That's actually one of the upper drainage reaches to the Wells Pond. So it's what we're really trying to do here is satisfy some of the local storm events that are within that sub drainage area for Wells Pond. And it does control a large portion of the mall, a large portion of some of the undeveloped properties in and around 9 Pond and the high school and some of the residential developments north of that. The red and the blue lines that you can see to the right of the plan right there represent the delineation of the 100-year flood elevation around Wells Run itself. Next slide. And I don't recall, Danielle, if this was my slide or your slide, but this is just sort of a history of what was occurring and how 9 Ponds came sort of to be. It really started well more than 10 years ago when we were working on a development project in Hyattsville, and University Park came to the table and said that there was a significant issue with Wells Run, and we needed to take a look at how we were going to solve that stormwater management problem. Over time, because it was such a large project that involved a lot of moving parts, we've progressed to the point where we're just inches away from having the actual construction permit. So I think there's been a lot of positive movement on that. And I think and as Danielle has sort of touched on, a lot of the developments over the last 40 years just didn't have the necessary stormwater management regulations in place. And developers will do what they're required to do, but if the regulations aren't there, it's hard to solve those problems. In this particular case, I should point out that the land is actually owned by some private entities that are going to continue to control the land, but are placing an easement on it for the benefit of Prince George's County. That's Bald Eagle Partners. They're the developer of the Dewey property. Next slide. So this is a little bit more detail. You can see that the development on the 9 Pond site is reflected here. There's 2 multifamily buildings and then a series of smaller multifamily buildings, 3 different builders, all that are clients of Bald Eagle Partners, which controls the overall property. 9 Pond is there in the middle. The blue line represents some amenities that will be built around the 9 Pond. So not only will this be a stormwater management facility for both water quality and water quantity, it'll be an amenity for the local residents and the community at large. The project started out as a water quality project, quite frankly, because that was the mandate of the Clean Water Partnership. And just, I mean, apropos, maybe not too much, but it probably provides about 140 acres of treatment, which is how your MS4 permits are measured for the benefit of Prince George's County. There's some numbers on here that may or may not make a difference to people. It's a fairly large pond, and we've maximized to the extent that we possibly could all the usable property for stormwater management and have attained almost all of the necessary permits. We're also doing a little bit of stream restoration to the north as another amenity. But where the pond really sort of shows its real chops for the purpose of this conversation, at least, is your flood control events. And while it won't solve all the problems downstream, it is certainly helping them, especially in this drainage area and especially right there at Toledo Road. Next slide. This is just another detailed slide of the actual construction documents that we've prepared and have submitted through a wide variety of agencies for review, both at the local level, Prince George's County, but also the state and federal level. So we've gotten significant number of reviews by significant review professionals, and have received all those approvals. Next slide. That's just the second part of the drawing. It's loading up a little slowly here because it's probably a big file, but that's the stream restoration portion. Next slide. And I think probably this is the point at which I turn it back over to you, Danielle. This is just a slide that demonstrates sort of the, really that Nine Ponds is one of many options that could be implemented to help reduce the amount of flooding that's downstream from the site.
Great. Next slide, please. And I will just pause to say, I know folks are putting in some stuff in the chat box. Ken and I will come back to those at the end. We're happy to stay on as long as needed to answer questions as best we possibly can, but I'm going to hold all the questions to the end. I think we're actually getting close to almost being done with the presentation. So we talk about multi-prong approach, right? Nine Ponds, part of the solution, not the only solution we need to make sure is on the table. One of the other pieces is sort of how we handle maintenance and how we repair. I know that your mayor and council, your town manager is in the midst right now of having Department of Public Works and Transportation come in and do a separate presentation, particularly on the Wells Run area that runs through Riverdale Park and the culvert project that's ahead of us. So stay tuned for that date and those details. These are actually pictures from when we did a walk back in 2020 with Mayor Thompson. We had the opportunity to walk through Wells Run and actually really get a sense of some of the challenges going on and actually some of the additional opportunities that exist because there's actually a lot of either barriers or perhaps impervious surface that's flowing into this Wells Run in Riverdale Park that with some strategic projects could be addressed. That includes like old streets that really are not used and sort of other dynamics that are along this culvert area and flowing into this watershed basin. Next slide. So here's a few other things that are in play. I just want to share with you so you get a sense of sort of the scope of other things in discussion. So one, the county right now is in the midst of developing a climate action commission, and we have a climate action commission and a plan that's in motion. That plan will be wrapped up the beginning of this year. Next year, I should say, beginning of 2022. We also earlier in 2021 passed a resolution requests that the county commence a countywide flood assessment mapping study with the Army Corps of Engineers. This is a huge undertaking and also not a cheap undertaking, but it will provide a comprehensive assessment and as well as flood risk. And I'll talk a little bit more about this because we're putting some of our ARP dollars to that. So I'll talk about it again in a moment. Next slide, please. We're also exploring legislation out of my office. So if all goes well, I am hoping that we will be passing this legislative year an update to the rain check rebate program. We are actually looking to increase the level. You might have noticed in that earlier slide that it's capped for residents at $4,000. We're looking to increase it up to $6,000. We think that's really important. Particularly to get at such things as changing your driveways and using pervious pavers. Those replacement costs are oftentimes a little more expensive. We're looking at adding conservation landscaping to the rebate program, currently not included. We're looking at addressing an inconsistency in the law right now about the tree canopy rebate and how it applies to municipal residents. So stay tuned on those details. If you're interested in coming out and support and speaking in the legislation, please feel free to email my office. I'll put my email in here. We'd love to have statements of support as we get this back in committee and hopefully wrap it up. We're in like our final negotiations with the Department of Environment on the second draft of this one. Next slide, please. We have also been creatively thinking about other legislation. And while this is not yet passed, I do want to talk about it because some of the residents in Riverdale Park, I know like the Michaeloff family and others in UP have already started to invest in best practices to make their home more resilient to ongoing flooding. And several of our homeowners in Riverdale Park have experienced multiple floods over a short period of time. We're exploring the ability to do a tax credit or rebate for homeowners who institute those best practices. That may include flood insurance. It may include wet flood proofing your home. It might include putting in a steel basement door that can withstand flood conditions and once again, help better seal your house if flooding is happening. It could include dry roofing or other sort of barrier systems. So stay tuned for us. We're in conversations with a few different folks about lifting this. I doubt this will pass this fall, but I'm pretty committed. I think this is a really smart idea. I think it's a really good idea. I think it empowers each of you with the support of the county government to implement some best practices to make your homes more resilient. And frankly, some of these best practices are not very inexpensive. So it's helpful for us to, I think, assist in those ways. Next slide. American Rescue Plan. I mentioned that we all have a lot of money that we don't typically have access to at the county and municipal level. How we use it, it is incredibly smart that we use it wisely. This is, you know, a once in a generation type funding mechanism that has arrived in terms of being able to move forward on projects and particularly to move forward on stormwater management projects. At the county level, we are using this to rapidly move forward on more storm management projects than we're typically able to do in our capital improvement plan. Next slide, please. We are also, as I mentioned before, putting significant money, about $2.3 million to this joint project with the Army Corps of Engineers. This is actually a description of it from our report on how we're using our ARP money. But I think the best way to explain this is sort of how this project contributes to addressing climate change. You can see that here, this project will address climate change by using recent rainfall projections. We're really going to look at the flow analysis. We're going to look very closely at the new dynamics that might be happening and the risk that is happening in light of climate change. So stay tuned on that. It's going to take a few years, to be honest with you, for this study to be wrapped up. But I want to let you know that it is moving forward. We're in negotiate. The first step is agreeing on all the details with the Army Corps of Engineers to initiate this pretty large scale project for our county. Next slide. All right, so additional resources and background. I'm not going to go through these, but we'll be providing this to the town, so you can definitely hyperlink those. And if you contact my office, we can definitely provide this too. Next slide, please. That's probably it. Yes, so honored to serve you. Please reach out. You can see our email here and our phone number. And I know there's some questions in the chat, so I have not been paying too close attention. So let me scroll to the top and just see what we got here. Okay. Okay, so Jessica, how would you like to handle the questions? Because I know people have put stuff in the chat box, but it might just be easier if the person asks the question verbally, because it just sometimes might help give some context. Would that be possible? Is that okay?
Certainly.
Okay. So Heather, I know you put a few things in the chat box. Do you want to take a moment and ask those? I know you wanted to have Ken maybe talk a little bit more about the data of what we would expect from the additional 9 ponds, but do you have other questions you want to pose as well?
Yeah, sorry, I have so many questions.
It's okay. It's all right. I'm fine with that. But how about this? We'll put you at 3 questions and then we'll go to the next person and we'll promise to come back if that's okay.
Totally fine.
Okay.
So I am curious, Ken, I'd love to hear you talk just because we have the advantage of having your time on here tonight. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about like just some of the numbers about what you I saw the whatever like 17 million gallons of water that you expect to be diverted from 9 Pond. I just don't have really a sense of how that translates to the kind of flooding that we've seen, you know, not just once every 100 years, but at this point, once every 2 years, especially in Wells Run, since you're talking with folks in Riverdale Park. So I'm curious about like the very concrete impact of 9 Pond on Wells Run. The other question, or another question that I have that might also be for Ken is, Danielle, I saw on the map that you went over that had a couple of arrows with water runoff directions. One of the things that we see in Ward 1 is when Wells Run hits its limit, that means that there's a ton of water runoff coming from new development just south of 410 that runs north of 410, north across 410 into Ward 1 of Riverdale. And so when Wells Run reaches its limit, then there's nowhere for that to go. And I didn't see that directional piece indicated on the map. And that what we see from our house is that's actually where a bulk of the water comes from. So I just wanted to make sure that like that was noted somewhere, because I want to make sure that we're accounting for that. So those were.
Heather, if you just want to pause there, maybe have Ken do the first question. And then on the last one, it is part of the analysis within Guilford Run. To be honest with you, I'm glad you shared your scenario with me, because my sense is actually some of the key solutions we need to look at Wells Run is in that sub watershed basin that flows from that 410 Baltimore Avenue area into your neighborhood. So I appreciate that that point you just made. But yes, we are aware that it does flow into, and I'm not surprised it does back up. So with that, I'll turn it back to Ken though to talk about the 9 ponds question.
Okay, thanks. Heather, or whoever's controlling the slideshow, it might be easier if we go back to that slide that had the math on it in order to talk about that a little bit more. In some
keep going
detail.
forward, Jessica. Actually, just pause right there. So Heather, just to go back to your second question, I believe what you're describing is this watershed that's described as DA equals 764 acres. Is that the one that you're talking about?
This is the map that I was talking about. I'm seeing
Correct.
direction of flow there, and it only accounts for what's coming from 9 ponds through Wells Run, but not accounting for flow that comes from other places.
Okay.
Yeah, the intent on this map was really just to talk about 9 ponds more than anything, which and 9 ponds is only providing, for lack of a better term, let's call it a solution for the drainage area, or DA, that equals about 300 acres there that you can see in sort of on the left-hand side. So for the most part, we were just sort of demonstrating the water that was coming from Wells Run, or the other tributary that gets to the point that we were studying, which is that red dot that's sort of directly in the center of the map that the DA 300 acres points at. That was just the purpose of that map. That's all.
And then
Let's see if we
Jessica,
can keep-
I think we need to go a few more slides for Ken.
Yeah, we need to go a couple more slides. Keep going.
One more.
I think it's one more.
Just one moment here. Technical difficulties.
It's okay.
Too far ahead.
There is a specific map. There's a specific example. And I'll try to do the best I can, Heather. And I'm not going to have the minute details because I don't, the plans have been long designed and it's been a little bit. But so as I mentioned, the project actually started out as a water quality project, and we measure the success of water quality for this program under the Clean Water Partnership as how many legacy impervious acres that we treat for water quality. And in this case, it was 140 acres worth of untreated impervious area that we are now treating, which removes phosphorus, nitrogen, and total suspended solids. And you may know all that, so I don't mean to be remedial if you do. But that's a fairly significant project. We've done some bigger ones, and we've done a lot of smaller ones. This one's on the sort of low end of a bigger project. In addition to that, what we figured out kind of quickly once we started conversing with the Maryland Department of the Environment and the Corps of Engineers is that this was also truly a flood control project. Now, I think the closest I'm going to get you to the answer that you need is that it's probably diminishing the 100-year flood elevation by about 6 inches through the area that it's impacting, and that's closer to where we're actually providing the control measure. As you get further and further down in the stream system, more and more water comes from additional drainage areas that is uncontrolled. So the impact of Nine Pond, the deeper you go into the drainage area, the deeper you go into Wells Run, you see less and less impact. But right at sort of Toledo Road and that immediate vicinity, you're getting about a 6-inch street test, which will not, and I'll say this a lot probably, it doesn't solve the problem in total, but it does provide a pretty good solution based on what we have available to do something with. So we took advantage of the opportunity we had, and I think we maximized and optimized everything we could there, both in terms of water quality, which is important to some, one group of people, and the water quantity that is important to a different group. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's actually super useful. That's the first time that I've heard anyone give an inch projection. I mean,
Right.
a year ago we had 1.5 to 2 feet of water
Right.
running through our backyard. So 6 inches is helpful. It's actually not going to mitigate flooding for us. There's a bunch of other stuff, to Danielle's point earlier, like there's a bunch of other stuff that we can do, and we're doing all of those things as individual homeowners. But I wanted to be clear, both for my own understanding and also other folks on the phone or on the call. Nine Pond is certainly not going to mitigate everything that we've been seeing. Again, not every 100 years, not every 500 years, but every 2 years. So we do want to be looking at additional solutions. And I'm, eager. I want other people to ask questions, but I'm eager to think about other solutions as well.
And Heather, I think that's really well said. I mean, we would be in a much worse spot if we were not about to get under construction with Nine Pond. I'll also sort of share that. So I really do credit the work of folks who've made this one possible and the advocacy. There's been a lot of work behind the scenes to get this one. It is not a simple project. It's also a fairly unique project now. We rarely build stormwater ponds in a stream, which this one is. So it has some unique features to it. But I agree with you. It is definitely not the complete solution. And we're going to have to be assertive, I think, and deliberate about us working towards additional solutions. And I think it's going to be, once again, this multi-pronged approach. There's not just going to be one avenue that needs to be pursued. I know there's a few other questions in here. Abby, I saw that you put a few in the chat. Do you want me to post those? I can probably answer them, but I want to give you the chance if you want to ask them directly.
Yeah, thank you so much, both Ken and Councilman Bergleros. I'm actually thinking on the topic of, needing a multi-prong approach. I'm actually thinking back to something that Mayor Thompson said when we met with him right after the major flood last year. And Mayor Thompson was talking about trying to use strategies in Riverdale that help people downstream too, right? Not just thinking of ourselves, which I really appreciated. Sorry about my dog. And so I'm thinking about some of the other mitigation strategies that people were talking about. The first is related to, rain gardens, as well as potential sort of berms and levees and things like that. If we put a berm or a levee in our yard, it would just go into our neighbor's yard, right? And we have also had like 2 properties in our neighborhood tear down pretty big portions of trees. So I guess I'm wondering, are there, with respect to sort of berms and levees and specifically flood walls, is that an option to be put up to protect parts of the neighborhood rather than individual homeowners putting that up? And I'm wondering whether or not there are, clearly there's incentives and you're trying to deepen them, which seems like a really great idea related to, some of the planting and what homeowners can do. Are there actually regulations against taking down significant amounts of, plantings and trees that exist that help with stormwater as well?
Okay, great question. I'll try to answer it the best I can. So big picture, for instance, if there was a new development project in an area that has some trees, like a fairly large scale, they would need to comply with the Woodland Conservation Ordinance. That was updated several years ago. You can Google it and find it online. It was part of one of many regulations that were put in place after the county put together its green infrastructure plan. But for specific private property, there is not any regulations that forbid people from cutting down trees on their property. The city of College Park is actually examining how they can improve their tree canopy, and they are looking at some very local ordinances also related to private property. So if you're interested in exploring this one, Abby, a little bit more, you might want to just follow or reach out to the city of College Park to see more what they're doing. But as of today, there is no regulations regarding private property in terms of tree removal. You know, an existing home, someone has 10 trees on their property, they decide to take a bunch of them down. There's no requirements associated with that. In terms of sort of flood walls and berms and so forth. So, I mean, flood walls and levees are a little different than berms. I should probably say that those mechanisms are a little different. And you're right, you have to be really smart about the placement, because what an individual homeowner could do on their property could have very much impacts on another property owner. I think this goes back, maybe Jessica, if you wouldn't mind going back to that map that has like the red outlines of the different drainage basins here at Wells Run. I go back to that map, I think it's a little earlier in the presentation, because I think as we think about next steps in the Wells Run watershed, what I really encourage us to do is, at the end of the day, we do need to hire someone to do an evaluation, further evaluation in the watershed, look at the sub-drainage basins, and then come up with some proposals as what they would recommend. It is possible that there could be some individual property owners that could benefit from using berms, and that would not impact other properties. It's possible that maybe some of the other items you put on the table might be good practices. What is probably most likely to me, and it goes back to what Heather said earlier, because I've seen that sort of flow of water coming into your neighborhood, right, from that drainage area basin of 764 acres. I mean, there is a lot of older portions of Riverdale Park that are not regulated with storm drain. I have no idea what the storm drain system is going under Baltimore Avenue in 410. Yes, there's some development over where the McDonald's is and the Wells Fargo Bank is and some other pieces, but a lot of that was actually developed before some of the upgrades to some of our storm drainage regulations. So I think there's some real interesting opportunities in that drainage basin that flows into that portion of the community, but we need to do the analysis to get there. And we need to understand where those wins could be. Could Clean Water Partnership be part of it? Could maybe some of those projects be funded with ARP dollars, either by Riverdale Park or Hyattsville or University Park? I think that's why we need to get to this next stage of stakeholder group. And frankly, we got to put some money in hiring someone to do this analysis, because that's what's going to help us really be a lot more strategic. So I hope I got a little bit to some of those questions you put out there, Abby, in terms of the questions you put out on the table. Let's see. I think Charles also had a question. Charles, I don't know if you're still with us or not, but I know you posed a question here about sort of east of the Northeast branch of the Anacostia River. So great question. I think this needs to be taken a look at. I agree with your concern. We actually saw flooding in this area on some. Oh, Charles, are you there?
Oh, yes, I am.
Okay. Do you want to talk about the question you posed?
Yeah, it's basically, I'm in a very old part of Riverdale, has a large apartment complexes with no storm drains at all. So there's commercial properties that have very low interest in the neighborhood and supporting it. And unfortunately, when we get these hard rains, my backyard is the only way to get to the Anacostia.
Yeah.
We don't have any storm drains for blocks. So it's a little frustrating each time we get these major storm events. I get a couple feet of water going right through my driveway to the creek behind me into the Anacostia.
Yeah, so Riverdale Park, if I could pause. So this presentation's a little bit probably more geared to the Wells Run watershed, but I would just point out there's some other challenges in Riverdale Park. So over the years, the county has actually been involved. In fact, we have a project going on right now with some homeowners, not quite adjacent to the Edmonston pumping station, but nearby, because Riverdale Park is incredibly low lying. If anyone's ever taken a look at the map of the river before the Corps of Engineer came in, you would see that the river, that northeast branch, it was like a snake and as curvy as you possibly can imagine. The Army Corps of Engineer project that came in, and actually I have some old pictures of this. I should have found them for this presentation, really sort of straightened it out. But it also meant that right immediately after that happened, a lot of places in Riverdale Park that were not considered developable, suddenly property owners decided that this could be developed on. And so a lot of those apartments you see near the Northeast branch are very much built in a area that's pretty fragile. And as Charles, as you mentioned, they were built back in like the 1960s, 1970s, really immediately after this Army Corps of Engineer project was built. And with very little stormwater management. So it's as the town is thinking about how it wants to approach stormwater management, while I do encourage a sort of watershed basin approach, I encourage that sort of same approach on the east side also of Riverdale, because we also have watersheds that are coming in that have a lot of impervious area into the community, and thinking about sort of holistically additional projects that we may want to look at or may need to look at. And Charles, with the storm drain piece, I'll note this one for DPW&T to sort of maybe look at a little bit closer. And also maybe to look at to see if this section might be an interesting candidate for maybe a clean water partnership type project. But let me take a look a little bit more, and I'll work with the town a little bit more on this one that you mentioned as well.
That would be exciting. That would be
Okay.
very neat.
But yeah, for the town, while I really am going to stress this watershed approach, we do have a few different watersheds that flow into here, and we need to understand each of those. They're each a little bit different, but important. Other questions that people might have, and my apologies, I wasn't looking at the chat box, so maybe I captured like the big questions out there, but other questions that people want to talk about at this moment. Once again, you might just want to digest it. It's a little late on a Thursday night. You know,
And Danielle, can I throw a few comments in?
Yeah,
based
please,
on the
Alan.
questions and answers that have come along so far? So in the September 10th flood last year, at the where Wells Run crosses over Baltimore Avenue, then the excess water flow during that was around 1,000 cubic feet per second. And so that means that the drainage that could possibly happen underneath the CSX tracks and underneath the trolley trail, those are the sort of constrictions, were overwhelmed by 1,000 cubic feet per second. And somewhere in my email, I don't have it readily accessible, but somewhere in my email, I asked someone in the county who were involved in that conversation, Danielle, what Nine Pond would have done in that situation. And the round number answer, with a little bit of hand waving, was about 500 cubic feet per second. So it reduces the issue by about a factor of 2, and just in terms of flow rate. That doesn't necessarily mean that a given house wouldn't still have had water flowing through their basement or through their first floor, but it solves it for an event similar to that by about that amount. So that's one issue, and I feel like that's a big deal. That's significant. It's something that's important. With respect to the multiple watersheds that you talk about, we are very well aware of this. And at the town council work session last week, then staff presented sort of a broad array of programs that we're looking at, and there are multiple watersheds. There's the watershed that's in Ward 3 that goes through the Edmonston pumping station if the station is working properly. There's the Wells Run, and just just to point out the multi-pronged issue that you discussed. So there's this constriction underneath the tracks that really reduces what comes in from upstream and what wells run, and what the 9 Pond project is going to address. And yet somehow in September 10th event last year, then between that constriction and Taylor Road, enough extra water came in that Wells Run jumped its banks there. And so, as you say, it's multi-pronged. We can't just, say this is going to solve the problem. 9 Pond would do nothing in that situation, nothing for that particular neighborhood. And so we have to look at other things. And then I guess my final comment is going to go back to what Abby said that I talked about with members of the community, which was, shortly after the event last year, which is that this water's coming down and we can't stop it from coming down. And so we have to decide what to do with it. And the two answers that I see are to store it somewhere or to send it downstream. And if we send it downstream, well, on September 10th last year, our downstream communities, Edmonston, Mount Rainier, and so on, they saw significant flooding there coming out of the Anacostia. So if we send it downstream, it's just going to add to their problems. And so we have to look at a way to store it, ideally, completely locally on each property, which is what the current county stormwater regulations require for new development, for significant redevelopment. And if that doesn't work, then look for other places. And as we discussed previously, then it may be reconfiguring parks to serve as surge stormwater storage areas and similar issues. And so just to touch back on Heather's question, one of the things that we are looking at in our interactions with the county on the brick projects is the Beale Circle Park and whether something can be done to improve storage in that area so that the storage from the 764 acres will at least be slowed down and the rate of flow through their neighborhood in an extreme storm event would be reduced. I think that's everything I wanted to say. Thank you.
Mara, that was wonderful. And thank you for sharing about the last town meeting. And I appreciate all those observations you mentioned and your leadership on this. I mean, both honestly, the mayor and University Park and you have been wonderful to work with. And you guys are really, I think, strategically thinking about how to address and solutions. And frankly, I think a little bit of how we can smartly use this ARP money to help deliver for our residents in the long run. Other questions that might be on here? What's the current construction timeline for 9 Pond? Ken, are you still with me? Yep. Ken, do you want to talk about where we are with the timeline from 9 Pond? We got a little delayed. We had to sort of cross some T's and dot some I's on something to get through another permit. There's been a lot of permits on this project from the feds and the state. But Ken, where are we with actually construction?
So we are, the first thing that has to happen is the property negotiation needs to be complete. So there are some easements that need to be signed and that's ongoing right at the moment. Once that happens, the CWP will issue what's called a budget book, and that kicks off their bidding process, and there's a pool of bidders that are already prepped for this project. So I would imagine that once we get that easement settled in the next month or two, that there'll be a 2-month bidding process. So I would tell you, we're looking probably first quarter of next year for construction to start at a, sort of maybe a worst case scenario.
And then it's about a 9-month construction period. Is that about right? Was I remembering correctly?
The majority of it will be done inside the 9 months. There'll be some tidy up and some cleanup because there's a lot of coordination that has to go on with the adjacent property as it's getting built as well. But the functional pond will be in 9 months after initiation of construction.
And then for purposes of funding, just for the public to know, the project is fully funded through the Clean Water Partnership dollars, which again, your tax dollars in action. Ken, do you remember what the price tag is on this project? I can't remember.
No, I don't off the top of my head.
Yeah, it's a pretty significant project. I'll just share with you all. This is not inexpensive, but I think it will help deliver some results for the community. I know Richard put a question in, will the pond and surrounding areas be available for recreation? There's a trail that goes around it, but I think that's probably about it immediately around that area. Is that about right?
That's correct. There might be a gazebo at the end of the day. But you know, I haven't seen any plans other than that, other than the trail and maybe a gazebo for recreational and amenity purposes.
Yeah.
So I'm primarily asking for selfish reasons to determine if I'll be able to fish in this pond or not.
You know, I kind of thought that's where it was going to go, and nobody's talked about stocking the pond, as far as I know, at least not to me.
If it helps, Richard, the Lake Artemisia is stocked. I think you probably knew that.
Yeah, and the little pond by College Park Academy is a great place to catch some bass.
Yeah.
They're small, but they're hungry. I can pull a few out in an hour.
Were you over there with I know you have a young son. There was a family over there just the other day fishing.
Wouldn't have been me with my son. I haven't taken him out there, but
Okay.
generally, since I'm still working remote, if it's around lunchtime and there's somebody throwing bait in the water, it's me.
Good to know. Maybe that's where we'll go hang out. We'll go fishing together. I can pull out
That's
my
perfect.
fishing pole. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Awesome. Okay. So I think once again, love to keep talking with you, Mayor and town manager John Listician. You know, please reach out anytime if we can be of assistance, because I know you guys are having lots of conversations. I really want to thank Ken because, you know, Ken didn't have to spend his night with us, and he's willing to do that. So I just really want to thank him for doing this, not just once, but twice, to share this presentation and get out in the community, and really appreciate it because he really does have all that engineering details that I think is really important.
You know, I appreciate it, but you guys sort of allow us to do it. So we're happy to be here.
Oh, we really appreciate it. But once again, please reach out anytime. I'm putting my direct email in the chat box. And once again, have a beautiful night. Enjoy the rest of the week. Hope the weather stays as lovely as today. And thanks again for the time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. And I want to encourage everyone to come to the upcoming town session on other stormwater projects.
And Mayor, when is that going to be? So I can try to actually make it.
I believe it's going to be at our work session. Is that right, Town Manager Listician? Is he still around? Looks like he may have dropped off.
It's okay. I'll text with you. Not a problem.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you all.